everyone, and welcome to our third session for the Becoming of the Lord, preaching the promise and challenge of Advent. So, of course, already it's Advent 3. Wow, time is just flying by. My name is Reverend Robert Cook, and I am lecturer and director of outreach programs here at Queen's College Faculty of Theology. Along with me, as always, is the ineffable Dr. Joanne Mercer. She is our homiletical expert guru here. She's the Yoda of the group today. Mark and I are just her young Padawans still in training with the Jedi Force. So yeah, we're really excited today to have as our special guest Mark Nichols, and I'm going to give Mark a chance to just say a little bit about himself, what he's up to these days.
Hi, so I'm Mark Nichols. I'm a priest in the Anglican Church, but almost over 2.5 years ago, I stepped away from parish ministry to get involved in social justice work in the broader community. And so currently, I am the work as the community organizer for the Workers' Action Network of Newfoundland and Labrador, organization that seeks to serve and organize low-wage workers in unstable, precarious employment in the province. Yeah, and I guess I'll just leave it there for now.
Mark is a very important voice in the church right now here in Newfoundland and Labrador. That's why we're so excited to hear what he has to say about these particular readings in this particular season. For those of you that this might be your first session that you're checking out for us. The whole idea behind the Becoming of the Lord with the B in brackets is that our focus here is not just on, the big story where God shows up and fixes everything, but our responsibility as individuals and as communities of faith in that becoming of the Lord and our own becoming as well as disciples of Jesus. So that's kind of where we're coming at this from a more practical perspective. So we always start our conversation by just handing it over to our guests to kind of share some of their initial thoughts, reactions to the readings or the theme of the week or even of the season. So, Mark, what's on your mind?
Well, it's an interesting theme, this idea of the becoming of the Lord, God waiting for us as opposed to us waiting for God. And so, with that theme in mind, when I looked at the readings, especially our first reading from Isaiah, both the Psalm and the Canticle, the Magnificat, I see, a theme of restoration. Um, and we've kind of looked at it. I mean, certainly in the history of the Hebrew people being restored from exile to the Holy Land, the Promised Land, and probably a lot of Christians look at this as pointing to the return of Jesus, the ushering in of the kingdom of God. But I can't help when I look at this theme of restoration, the way that I look at Jesus himself, because we've always talked about Jesus as being fully God and fully human, but I think the church has really emphasized the fully God part and not paid enough to the implications of Jesus being fully human. So in Jesus, I believe we get the fullest look at God we will get in this earthly life, but also in Jesus, we get the fullest look at what it means to be fully human that we will get in this life. And when I look at the theme of restoration today, that's what comes to mind, that being restored to the fullness of our humanity, which has all sorts of implications for the world in which we live.
Yeah, I like that, Mark. I like that you started with Isaiah because, I'm an Old Testament kind of gal. I taught you well. But I mean, I like that. And that restoration going to Isaiah is not just a restoration to our full humanity, but it's a restoration of all of creation. And this has been a theme really of up until now in the readings we've had, right? That this sort of longing to return, not just a return to the Holy Land, not just a return to their country, but a return to their right relationship with God, the return almost to the Garden of Eden, the return to Genesis 1, return to this sort of notion where all is good. And I love the predominance of images from nature and the sort of focus on the creation and the image of that crocus, who always shows up when it's least expected, usually through the snow in Newfoundland. um, but like that I agree. I like the notion of restoration, and that restoration is both a future and a present thing in Isaiah, right? Like this is God's going to do these things, but Isaiah also says that God is here, and we need to really, our part of becoming, I think, and I said this in Advent 1, is for us to see, right, as the prophets see things happen. So us to look, what signs do we see? What are our crocuses? Sort of like, what signs do we see of God's becoming around us? What kinds of signs do we see of restoration? Because it's really easy for us to talk about how horrible we are, how horrible creation is, what a horrible state everything is in. But I think we are called to sort of look with the eyes of God, and to sort of embody that full humanity that you talked about, Mark, and to show and point to the signs of God doing a new thing, which is kind of ties a little bit into the gospel, which I'm sure Rob is very dying to talk about. But that, where Jesus says to John's disciples, go tell him what you see. Tell him the signs of the things, how right relationships are being restored. See those signs, right? Because they could easily go back and talk about all the things that hadn't happened, right, that they may have expected to happen, but instead to see the things that are happening. And I think I have no illusions. I am confident that God is active and doing things in our world, probably in ways that are unexpected, that we don't recognize, and are so radical that we don't even want to recognize, because then it would be implied that we have to join God in that radical work of restoration. So restoration is a great word for the Sunday, I think.
Yeah, I think those things often aren't even on our radar. So they don't, like you say, they don't even register that they're things that God is involved in and, pushing forward. And I was just, when I was listening to both of you talking, that word restoration and then the idea of restoring creation. Another thing that the church has done often and still does a lot today is this idea of escapism, like, that here, our home here on earth is only temporary, right? That the goal is to get out of here, right? And that we can make the whole Christian story like an insurance plan, right? Like, the point is to go somewhere else. So I love the Isaiah reading that takes us back to the earth, to the ground, to the land, to creation itself, and says, no, this is our goal here. This is our focus, is restoring this and joining God in, to use the language from Revelation, the making new of all things, right? Like, this is something that we're called to hear, right? And it is connected with the gospel, which I will talk about now. I love this gospel reading, and the one thing that really struck me this week was the change in tone in John the Baptist from last week, Advent 2, to Advent 3. A lot of that has to do with the change in context, right? So last week, John is in his element. He's out in the wilderness, wild hair, honey encrusted beard, the camel skin, all that stuff. And he's, you can hear that booming voice every time when I read the passage of John baptizing. I think of the greatest story ever told, where there's that, is it the greatest story ever told, or one of them anyways, the one where Charlton Heston is John the Baptist? You're both looking at me with blank stares, so you don't know what I'm talking about. So there's this big, panoramic shot where the camera comes right in and then zooms up on Charlton Heston and his big booming voice, prepare ye the way of the Lord, and you brood of vipers, and the axe is already against the tree to cut it down. Very confident, very bold, right? It's hard not to get kind of, riled up with that. Then this week, John's in jail, of course, and so the tone is so different. He sends his disciples to ask Jesus, are you sure? Are you sure this is it? Are you sure you're the one, or should we expect someone else? And I love the answer that Jesus gives back. He says, well, tell them what you've seen. The blind see, the deaf hear, the lame can walk, the dead are raised. And I can imagine them going back to John and telling them, and John be like, what? What does that even mean? That's not, you didn't even answer my question. But what that scene bewilders me, because if anybody should know, it should be John the Baptist, right? He should know what's going on. But then on the other side is, not even John could fully grasp what was going on, right? And we spend so much time trying to figure out, what do we do next? What's the plan? What's the program? What is this going to look like? And I'm not sure that's what we're like, I'm not sure we're called to have some big divine, big plan, some, mission plan or program or something, but we're called to see, join in, take part, right? To me, like, I spend so much time getting frustrated with, the lack of plan sometimes. But maybe that's not the point. It's not about having the plan. It's just about seeing what's going on and finding ways to jump in with that, right? To take part and get involved. Okay, now we're done.
I didn't know if you're looking at
I'm
me
done.
or
Sermon
not.
over. Sermon over.
This you were mentioning about escapism, and Joanne, you were mentioning about this is the Isaiah passage in particular being have a sense of the future, but also a sense of right now. And I think the one thing, so this escapism thing, this idea that this earthly life a test, an obstacle course to see who gets to go to the good place and who goes to the bad place or whatever, like it just seems like a diminishment of all of our sacred stories to talk about things like that. And God created this world and saw that it was good. God created us and saw that we were good and entrusted this world into our care. This earthly life matters, so much so that God joined us in this earthly experience in the person of Jesus Christ. So this dismissal of the here and now, where we find ourselves in history, really bothers me. And especially when it leads you to look away from injustice, whether we're talking environmental injustice or injustice between various parts of the human family. And so, in this idea of this concept of restoration, I really feel strongly that it is something that we're to engage in. And I kind of have sympathy for John the Baptist here, wondering if Jesus is the one, because John saw himself with a particular mission. And I think that every person who's been fighting for social justice or whatever, when they're breathing their last, they're going to wonder, like, did I make a difference? Does it, like, it's not fixed yet or whatever, right? And we have to have kind of some sense that this work is ongoing, and we have to have the humility to recognize that we're this like tiny piece of it, but an important tiny piece. We're called to be this tiny piece. And so, yeah, it's hard when you're engaged in the work that I'm engaged in, and I'm engaged in this work as an expression of my faith. A lot of people I work with don't. They just they're coming from a humanist perspective. But all of us would like to see all of this fixed tomorrow. But all of us, if we're honest, we know it's not. We're going to get some victories along the way, but we need to keep pushing, right, for that restoration. So I that would be my challenge to people who follow Christ is I think we would all agree the world is not as it should be, not as it was created to be, and the human family is not created to be. So when we're talking about restoration, are we just talking about this future event? Or are we talking about something we engage in the here and now, working towards this grand future? So I think it's important that we talk about the here and now, the present tense aspects of these readings.
Yeah,
Well,
I completely agree, and I think when Robert talked about, Jesus not really fitting in to John's vision of what that restoration was going to look like, so John was unsure. I do think, and Robert and I talked about this week. We've had several theological disagreements this week, but that's okay. That I don't think that's our task, right? To have this vision of what the restoration looks like, and I think we could easily delude ourselves into thinking we're doing good work by planning out what it is God should be at. Where instead of looking at what God is at, and Isaiah is very clear, like strengthen the weak hands, make firm the feeble knees, like get at it. And I think we could talk about restoration till our cows come home, as they say, or we can live as if we are restored. I mean, that's what we believe as Christians, isn't it? Like through the resurrection, that we are, we are restored as we are being restored. It's a present and future thing. And so that Jesus is here, God is here as God is coming. And so we live that as if it's a reality. And so we strive for these right relationships, and we refuse to accept anything less as being, compromised or anything, because that is not, we are created good. God said and it was good. So let's live as if we believe that to be true. And that's our little bitty bit, sort of like that I don't have in front of me, so I can't quote it perfectly, but that statement from the Talmud, that we are all called, towards this work of justice. None of us can complete it, but none of us are able to let it go either, right? Like, so that's our task as humans, is to reflect God's glory by being a part of God's work of restoration, in not accepting anything less of ourselves, while always falling short and trying again. Circle, circle.
that's
I
why
just want to, if I can just because Joanne just said it, but that quote from the Talmud, Rob shared it recently on social media, and then I kind of reshared it, and I couldn't believe the traction that it got within the social justice community. It resonated with them, that idea.
That's what we're called to
So
be.
because they don't normally respond well to religious tweets or things like that, but that saying really resonated with a lot of people. So they do totally get that they're not going to finish the work, but that they must engage in them.
and this is where I think James, the epistle reading, can be helpful here, right? And give us a bit of encouragement along these lines, because James is talking to his people about being patient and encouraging each other in the work, because I agree with Jane. Like, I think we delude ourselves if we think, first of all, if we think the work is about us. It's not. And if we think we're going to complete the work and make everything right in our lifetime, we're not. And so the verse 10 in the epistle reading, I think, is a great, it teaches us humility, right, in the face of all this. As an example of suffering and patience, beloved, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. And many of those prophets never saw the promises and the hope that they held so dear, and proclaimed, and often, in some cases, enacted, like lived out themselves. They never lived to see what they were proclaiming. And I think this, we can take some comfort and encouragement in that we're not going to complete the work, but we get to take part in the work. We get to participate in what's being done. And I was saying to Mark and Joanne before we started, like, that's what keeps me going. Because there are days, I don't know if, other people who are going to be watching this, who work for the church, who have bad days where you think, what am I doing? Why do I do this? Why have I devoted my life to this? But it's that idea that I get to play a small part for a short time in the things that God is doing in the world. And I get to be a part of a community, the church, that is, trying its best in a broken, messed up, what was the terminology I used the other day? This beautiful mess of a thing we call the church, right? But we're trying. We don't get it right, but we're trying. And I think that's really, really important for us to be reminded over and over again about that truth. Now, we're starting to run out of time. Joanne, did you want to say something before we get to Magnificat?
Well, I'm going to have another theological disagreement with you.
Oh.
I know, because I think that the prophets did see the fulfillment of their words, because they saw it when before they spoke it. They saw it in everything around them. They saw that fulfillment. So I think we think of time, and I'm going to quote back to you, I think from last week, as a linear thing, right? So we think of Christ as the fulfillment, or we think of something later fulfillment, but time within the Hebraic notion, goes in circles and in cycles. And so I think that suffering and patience is when people speaking what the prophets did, they spoke what they saw, and not everybody else could see it or believed what they saw. And that's sort of probably, for folks like us, leadership, people who are in prophetic leadership in all kinds of ways, that's where the patience comes, not in so much waiting for God, but the patience in getting people to realize the significance of what these words say. I don't know if you two have ever had this experiences, but I've had this experience way too many times in ministry where I'm preaching something and people are just like, and I'm gonna go, this is really, really important. Like this like really, like this is like, if you get this, like you will be so much happier. Like you need to get this. That's the kind of patience I think. And I didn't want to shake anybody. I'll just let you know I didn't do it. But I mean, that sort of, when you can see what God's calling you to, like when I'm sure, the kind of passion that Mark has for social justice work, when you see that this is what God wants us to do, and you can't convince other people, like it's like that's where you need the patience, I think, and that's where we need the patience of becoming of the Lord, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So in the readings for this week, you have a choice when it comes to the psalm. You can either use Psalm 146, or you can use Luke 1, the Magnificat, as a canticle. In our pre-recording conversation, the Magnificat did come up because, well, it's a really great piece of scripture. So either of you have any thoughts about that particular read and how it might tie in with some of the themes that we're talking about here today, or that kind of overarching theme of the becoming of the Lord? What do you see there?
You want to go ahead, Joanne?
No, you go. I need a break.
Always what strikes me, even outside of the theme that we have before us, when I look at the Magnificat, is just the language in it that talks about that kind of almost preferential status for the powerless, the poor, that's so contrary to the world that we live in. And it's not just there, it's in other places, but in the Magnificat, like you really hear it, right? And that really stands out to me in this kind of like restoration, that's such a high priority. When the prophets speak, when Mary sings her song, that's such an important thing. And I think in Jesus' ministry, that's made very clear too, that the ones that we look at as the least are in fact the ones that are elevated. So that certainly informs my work and the way that I live out my faith. I think it's something for us to consider too when we talk about this restoration of living out the fullness of our humanity.
I think the Magnificat really ties all the pieces and themes together, and that notion of the future and now, like that God, she doesn't speak about God going to do these things, but that God's doing these things, right? God has done these things. His mercy is here. He is filling the people with hungry. Like it is that immediacy of the presence of God that I think is so vital to understanding restoration.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's like this is always what God is about.
Always.
Regardless of, if it's in Isaiah's time or, the John's time, the early church's time, our time, this is what God is doing. And so, again, I agree, it ties it kind of all together, right? And helping us to see, a glimpse of what this might even look like in our time, right? Because these are all still issues that we're talking about all the time. You turn on the news, and every day we're talking about, poverty and low-waged workers and injustice and the climate crisis and, everything. It's just there all the time, and it's almost like, like Joanne said, she wanted to take. It's like God is saying, "Smarten up, come on!" Like, can't you see what it is that I'm doing in the world, right? So I love the Magnificat, right?
And it's joyful, right? And that's the same thing with
Yes.
the Isaiah. Like, it's traditionally this Sunday is a joy Sunday. That this is a woman, young unmarried woman who's pregnant, living in an occupied country. Like, let's not make illusions that this was an easy song for her to sing, right? That in the midst of all of that, she's overwhelmed by God's power and might and God's salvation, and that are so much so that her soul magnifies the Lord. Like, and so I mean, I think that's it's like it's not one or the other. Sometimes we think of God's restoration being, as I'm known to say, like holding hands and skipping and singing kumbaya. It's not like it happens in the midst, like same as in the midst of occupation, in the midst of war, in the midst of poverty, in the midst of injustice. People boldly stand up and proclaim God's joy and presence and salvation and restoration. That this is not God's dream for us or God's desire for us, and I refuse to accept it.
Yeah. And I think the most important thing probably that Mary does, or even literally says in this wider passage, it's not in this particular Magnificat, but the most important thing she does is she says yes to this vision, this desire that God has for us, as a human species, and even to take it wider, as Isaiah says, for the entire cosmos, because, we should be reminded over and over again, all these things are interconnected. It's not like there's creation over here and then we're over here. Like it's all interconnected, and one impinges on the other one, right? So saying yes, right, to what God is doing, what God is calling us to, I think is really important. Any last nuggets of wisdom, Mark, before we wrap up our time?
I would just throw the challenge out to those who are watching this or listening to this. What does it mean to participate in this restoration that, in a sense, has already happened and is in the process of happening? And so, what does that mean? Because I think in Advent we can fall into this personal piety of preparation, and I think there's more to this than that, and that's part of it. I mean, we engage in sincere prayer and acts of personal piety or whatever during this season of Advent. But if we're preparing for the second coming, right? Like, how do we prepare ourselves, and how do we prepare the world around us for that? And what does that look like for each of us individually?
We always try to tie in the alternative colics, or what, the one that we pick out. Let's be honest.
One you pick out.
Yeah, let's be totally honest. The one I pick out. But I think this one, does tie together some of the things that we've been talking about in this third Sunday of Advent. God, for whom we watch and wait, you sent John the Baptist to prepare the way of your Son. Give us courage to speak the truth, to hunger for justice, and to suffer for the cause of right, with Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks so much, Mark, for being with us today. It's a lot of fun.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next week for Advent 4. Oh my God, Christmas is coming. It's just around the corner. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.